All right, are we good? Okay, here we go again. Testing, testing. All right, second try at recording this presentation. Let's see if it actually works this time because Yuja didn't want to upload it. Okay, so family theories. We're going to be talking about family systems theory in particular. I have a presentation. I'll be adding that somewhere in this video because I can't use Yuja apparently. The general overview of it. Families as whole units have more social strengths than each individual alone, according to Smith and Hammond from our text. That basically implies the fact that let's just take the cake analogy right out of the textbook, where you have each individual ingredient and they have their own individuality, but as a whole, the entire product, the cake, because you have the eggs, the milk, and so on and so forth, they come together and they create an entity that is greater than the sum of all of its parts. Family behavior, norms, values are contextual. Each family is different. Individual behavior affects the family as a whole. As they're interconnected, heavily interconnected, and family systems theory dictates that whenever something happens on a smaller scale within the microsystems, if you want to apply Yuri Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model to it, in the microsystem, it affects the greater part of it. Everyone's going to be affected from it. Families are goal-seeking, priorities and roles are contextual and dynamic throughout life. That is, they're constantly changing to a degree. Not always changing, but they are dynamic. They have the capability to change, therefore not static. And roles and priorities are contextual. It depends on the family in particular. So if you can say, how would an example of a dynamic role be? Let's just say a student graduated from high school, or they're graduating from college, and their role in the family is, let's just say, they're the daughter and they are a student, but they lose the role of a student as they go to pursue work. They also lose the role of daughter in the family, and in the microsystem there, at least they're not going to be, oh, she's not the daughter anymore. It's just the role in the family, because if she moves off, she's an employee, she's on her own. More about the general overview. Families maintain themselves through feedback, positive or negative. That kind of has to do with energy and entropy, which we'll get on. We'll basically touch base with later on in this lecture. But for a brief overview, families, they maintain themselves through feedback to avoid crises or situations. Depending on their boundaries and whatnot, they'll act differently in order to maintain their personal status quo, whatever fits within their range of personal norms. Communications are core values within families. You have these four types of communication. You have syntactics, which is the clarity of communication. You can consider noise, or not being able to clearly understand what is being announced in a family, so to speak. You have the semantics, which is the meaning behind the communication. Are you understanding exactly what they're telling you? Are you interpreting it the right way? You can correlate that with the symbolic interactionism theory, where take for example, definition of situation. That could apply somewhat to this, because they may see this as someone else may see, like, oh, why would you do this or that? Some families may advocate friendly violence in the family, just harmless fun in the family. Some families are okay with that. Some are more astute and stoic, and they're like, no, I don't want to get out and let my kids get dirty and play in the mud and that kind of stuff. Definition of situation, basically. And that can apply to communication to a degree. Then you have pragmatics, the result of communication, how it's going to impact. That can also lead to positive or negative feedback, in a sense. And then you have Metacommunication. What is metacommunication? It's basically talking about talking. So, how would I describe that off the top of my head? It's kind of, I'm so sorry, discussing, let's say, a father or just someone in the family discusses with someone how they want to have discussions. More or less. It's quite basic how it works. And as our text mentions, it can be explicit or implicit, implied or subconscious. You can have verbal and non-verbal cues. That would be the implicit nature of it. Moving on to slide 4 here. Families have roles, obviously. Each member of the family has a distinct role. You have the father, the mother, the son. It doesn't even have to be a father and mother because, a family is constituted of interlinking microsystems. It could just be a couple who have no children, and it could be an unmarried couple. It could be an extended family. Who knows? There's so many different definitions that can be applied to it. Roles can be dynamic over time, as aforementioned. They're not static, obviously. Roles will be changing, and an individual will eventually graduate from college and seek employment. And that can also affect the roles of other people in the family, which we'll cover in a bit. It's comparable to family development theory, which in this case, you have the cycles of life stages. Excuse me. Changes in one individual's roles can result in changes of another family member's roles, as I just kind of mentioned inadvertently before I actually got to the part where I was supposed to mention it. Basically saying like the launching stage 6 in the family development theory, is that the college student goes on to get a job and loses the role of student, becomes an employee. Likewise, the parent loses the role of being a parent, and they go on to seek other goals. As Smith and Hammond from our text describe, families are goal-seeking. Now we're on to the next slide. Hierarchy. That's a funny word. Hierarchy. Based on established rules, explicit or implicit, roles, norms, etc., according to our text. Does not always necessarily pertain to the traditional patriarchal nuclear family. Essentially speaking that the hierarchy can be twisted around in a family. If you want to think about that clip from the other week from Super Nanny, where basically their 4-year-old kid had rule over the household because they would cater to his needs to avoid the negative feedback, which was his temper tantrums, basically. And that would be, in this case, the implicit norms, because he doesn't say, oh, hey, you're obligated by contractual law to abide by my own personal jurisdiction. What was that? In order to prevent me from freaking out. He doesn't say that. Obviously, it's implicit, it's implied. But that is just one of the many cases of that. You have boundaries. Families develop boundaries based on their communications, and you have 3 different kinds. You have open, closed, and random. And the open, obviously, they're more flexible and structured. For a closed family, you would be thinking about rigid, enmeshed kind of families, if you want to think about David Olson's circumplex model. And then you have random, which would be chaotic and disengaged to a degree. What do we have here? Next, we are covering entropy and energy in a family system. Entropy is obviously the gradual decay of energy. Families readjust to prevent entropy. For example, developing new rituals, and that can result in positive or negative feedback. Say, for example, like just a relationship between two people. a marriage, perhaps. They don't want to get in a divorce or anything, but over time, if you want to think about uh, uh, passion and commitment, eventually decaying, that's entropy in the relationship, that eventually dies down after so long, and then they seek to put more energy back into this. This is just for like marital reasons, for other reasons as well, but this is just for one particular example. Excuse me, jeez. Um, Developing new rituals, in a sense, it would be more like going on bike rides every day, fostering more together time. Like, say if the two spouses, each of them had a job. One goes to work, the other one goes to work, and I don't know. What if they have a kid and then he leaves at home and he gets neglected somewhat? He had the babysitter and everything, and he doesn't get the attention that he so wants from his parents specifically. But let's just leave him out of this equation. I'm going too deep into this. They want to reestablish a connection, so they add new rituals to it. Maybe there's a positive feedback where they're like, sure, okay, yeah, let's go on bike rides every now and then. Let's have a movie night on weekends to have family time. But then you also have the negative feedback. Sometimes they won't like that. You're deviating from our established norms and already established rituals. We don't want that whatsoever. Don't do that. And then you have rules, which, as previously stated, can be explicit or implicit. Explicit would be like, here are the 10 commandments, read them. And then you have implicit, implied, feedback, positive and negative. Deviating from norms to support change would be positive. Deviating from norms but discouraging that change, negative. Then you have the equilibrium of the family, that homeostasis, as Smith and Hammond refers to. Families seek that balance. Now, the balance varies from family to family. Some families refuse to change, which would be rigid families. Some families change too much, which would be chaotic, according to David Olson, his circumplex model. Excuse me. Now, each family is going to have their own rules and hierarchies again, but they'll also have their own specific balance, because each family is going to have their own particular norms and values set, their own little microsystem outside of the macro system. Again, Bronfenbrenner's model on this. Because obviously you have the societal norms and what is seen as acceptable on average on a larger scale in the macro system, and then on a micro system, they kind of have their own free range to implement their own personal norms within a household. Just for lack of better wording, some families perhaps applying more not structural functionalism, symbolic interactionism theory to this. You have the front stage and backstage view. And let's consider the Walls family from the Glass Castle, where the family is very open, very vulgar. They just kind of disregard what other people think. So they're kind of going against like the macrosystem norms, and they're just kind of bleeding out their microsystem norms into the society, as evident when they went to the hospital, or how they have their frequent outbursts and fights, and they just kind of disregard anyone else around them. Let's see where we're at. Flexibility. Family behaviors are represented on a continuum, and now we come to the meat of what I've been talking about, David Olson's circumplex model. You have chaotic, flexible, structured, and rigid. Chaotic would be incoherent roles, lack of roles, and constant changing. Flexible families would be more, they have more discipline, rules, and roles, and open leadership. They share leaderships, essentially. Excuse me. Then you have structured families. They have more stability, but on that continuum, they're leaning towards more, a less open leadership. This is getting closer to that uh, parental guidance, that strict rule, like my way or the highway kind of mentality. And then change is accepted to prevent crises. But then you have rigid. You have they're very in. They can be enmeshed. That is, they cling to one another. They hold them into that microsystem, and they don't let them out. That is a closed family, as opposed to the flexible and structured, which would be more like open families, and then chaotic, which would be random, as mentioned previously. And then, as I have it written there, rigid families could display helicopter parenting. Obviously, it's where they very sheltering of their children. They won't let them do anything. Practically authoritarian in nature. And this brings us to boundaries, which we just basically covered, is open families, flexible and accepting to change. Closed families are enmeshed, authoritarian, and hesitant towards change. Now, whenever I say authoritarian, I'm just meaning they have a sort of this analogy. To propose an analogy here, somewhat similar to that of a dictatorship, where they're saying, here are the rules right here. You're not allowed to deviate from them whatsoever. Now, this may not go for every single enmeshed family there is. There's probably some exceptions. Some days they'll feel like, oh yeah, sure, it's fine. But then for the most part, their habits will be to enforce these rules whereby there's not a lot of freedom exhibited. Then you have the random families where they're chaotic, disengaged, and have very loose rules. They're just kind of like helter skelter. Here you go. That seems like a very close description for the Walls family and the Glass Castle, but they also have similar properties from like the closed families for the enmeshed, but not so much authoritarian rules, particularly. And now, feedback on change. Changes can affect the homeostatic nature of the family, throws off the equilibrium. Some changes may result in encouragement, which it says here, a flexible family might make adjustments to rules based on proposed rituals, applying new rituals to family life, encouraging energy, as we mentioned previously, to demote entropy, so to speak, like having a movie night. And then other changes may result in discouragement, which is negative feedback. And an enmeshed family may resent socializing outside or deviation from rules. Excuse me. And on the topic of rules, we have what is considered a norm in the family. They have their own little set, like their own little biodome, so to speak, of rules. This is the family within a larger community. Just disregarding all of that around it, you have the family. They have their own little set of rules. They do this and that in their own personal backstage view. But they also hopefully implement a front stage view, again implementing the symbolic interactionism theory here. In public, the front stage view would be that sense of professionalism, not cursing someone out in public just because it's like, oh, haha, it's funny at home. Nope, is not going to fly, because the Bronfenbrenner's model would dictate that the macro system ain't going to have any of that, for lack of better wording, because that's where all the average societal norms are going to be carried for like a certain area. on a larger scale in the economy. And then rules may be explicit or implicit, as aforementioned. Explicit rules may dictate what is verbally demanded, and implicit rules are learned subconsciously through implied communication, according to Smith and Hammond. Now, to provide an example on that, on implicit nature, depending upon the communication and the rules and hierarchy set in the family, it's going to be based on how the rituals go. Like in our book, it mentioned how I believe it was the father had the TV remote, and it's like, oh, only he's allowed to use the TV remote whenever they're watching TV. You know, it's only him, no one else. No one else is. Or the mom is allowed to yell at the other people, but do not yell at the mom. That's just implicit rules that are learned over time. Excuse me. Ooh. Now, family roles may have, or excuse me, family rules may influence implicit rules. The going back to the beginning of this chapter for the family systems theory, you have the topic of the firstborn, the roles of the hero, the firstborn of the family. He may be implicitly expected to refrain from going to parties instead of doing homework or skipping classes. You know, he may have like the weight of the world weighing him down, essentially, because you're going to go to college and you're going to make this family proud. You're going to be the first one to go to college out of this whole family. That kind of scenario. And then you have the second, which child described in our text, which is labeled as the delinquent, and they'd be allowed to get away with such. They're the scapegoat, as Smith and Hammond refers to. They just get away. They get away with everything, and that's a prime example of implicit rules in action in a family, where the firstborn is expected to adhere to these rules, and they have higher expectations to meet, whereas the secondborn is just like, yeah, just go do whatever you want to do. Then you have the hierarchy, obviously, which is influenced by these rules. Enmeshed or closed families may establish strict authoritarian roles that prevent external socializing or whatever have you. They don't let them outside of that little microsystem. No, don't get out. Don't get out of the biodome. Disengaged or random families, excuse me, may lack rules altogether. Hint, the Walls family. And then you have flexible and structured or open families. They have balance and they can share their rules. More so for the flexible, but less so on the structured scale. But since this is on a continuum, because you have the chaotic family, the flexible family, the structured family, and then the am I really forgetting this last one? After the structured family, you have the rigid family. You want to look for that balance in between flexibility and structure to be able to share the leadership and the roles and the rules and everything, and basically have this open-minded, open family, essentially. Now, implicit rules, the implied subconscious rules, may dictate who runs the family. That brings us again back to what I was talking about earlier, the Super Nanny clip, where they work around whatever rules rather they may have previously established, and generated new rules to cater to the needs of their 4-year-old, because he would throw a fit whenever he wouldn't get his way with anything. So essentially, he's the rule maker. He is the leader. Like, he is on the top of the food chain right here. He is there. Here's the hierarchy. Here's number one. That's him. That's Zachary. And then below that are everyone else, because they basically fall before him to make sure he doesn't freak out, for a lack of better wording. Then you have, oops, I skipped a page. Context of responses, basically. Families are contextual, obviously. Excuse me. Their behaviors are contextual. Comparable to the symbolic interactionism theory. Again, that brings us back to definition of situation. Different families have different norms, and what one person outside of the family may perceive as wrong may be it that may be a norm within the family. Like there could be families who just they do rough housing and everything, and like I said, there could be a more stoic family. They're like, why would you let your kids punch each other like that? It's not advisable, but that's what happens in some families. Some families just let them tumble on the floor, um, eat off the floor. It's just like, oh, what are you doing? And it's like, oh, we do it all the time. Kind of how it works. They have their own little social group. That is what a family is. But not all members in the family are going to necessarily agree with that by any means, because there are plenty of cases where there are just children or parents even who disagree with the rules established in the family. They're like, what is going on? Why are we like this? Good. And then deviations from personal norms can lead to positive and negative feedback. For example, Jeanette Walls from the Glass Castle, after going to the hospital, their family didn't like the doctor's practices or anything. They're like, no. They're pretentious. They're referring to the doctors as pretentious, that is, and they think, oh, we could do just a better job in general. We just patch you up, just put some bandages on you. We're not afraid of fire or anything. They got some negative feedback there, so they take her out of the hospital without paying, obviously. Then you have stressors in family life. You have families who handle it in a variety of different ways. You have the ABCX model from the family stress theory in our text. That is, the ABCX model would represent the stressor itself, and then the family strengths, how they consider to cope with this stressor, and then the response, the consequences. And then finally, the X in the model is the crisis that could come about if they cannot prevent this from happening, because they evaluate it, and then if they cannot, they slip into a crisis. Depending upon the rules, boundaries, etc., certain families may react differently to preventing crises. And then one member's reaction to stress can affect the family as a whole. Which basically implies how, again, as Smith and Hammond quotes in their text, the whole is greater than the sum of all of its parts. It's kind of like a Jenga board where you pull out one of the Jenga pieces near the bottom, or just whatever part of it, and the whole tower comes crumbling down. That's symbolic to how the family's going to work. A problem happens with one person in that family, the whole family is going to get affected. If there's a crisis involved, there it goes. There goes everything. It's not always a crisis, but handling the crisis, that's how it affects the family. Each of the members they're interconnected. And overall, families seek to reestablish that equilibrium, which in this case, equilibrium to one family may be an equilibrium, a totally different thing. It may be an off balance to another family, as evident by how they have their own norms. The Walls family. Now we have the family as a whole. Each individual plays his or her own part. All individuals make up more than what they are worth alone, considering the family. That's what we went over. And what I have drawn up here is a little photosynthesis analogy, just the simple formula for it. You have the carbon dioxide, the water, and sunlight all working together to help the plant to create glucose and oxygen. So that just basically means you have carbon dioxide, that's an element. You have water, you have sunlight. Those are three individual things on their own, but together, when they go and the plant absorbs it, it makes glucose, it makes oxygen, and that has a double standard for it. It can the glucose and the oxygen can benefit the ecosystem around it because other plants and animals can use this. Other biological life, basically. So, in a sense, the whole is greater than the sum of all of its parts, and it also establishes itself within the community and benefits the community as a whole. So we can see as the macro system, the family is a strong component in it. So that essentially implies how the family can function within the society and keep it basically fostering the norms on a macro system scale. And that essentially concludes the basics of family systems theory.